What if your perception of time can actually influence how quickly you recover from an injury? For episode 1 of All Trek, we explored just that with receipts. I am excited to welcome Mr. Peter Aungle, a Ph.D. candidate in psychology at Harvard University. He received an accelerated master's in experimental psychology from Harvard and a bachelor's of arts in psychology from UC Berkeley. His research largely focuses on psychological influences on physical health. He recently released a fascinating study which left me in complete awe. But before we get to that, welcome to All Trek, and thank you for agreeing to this interview.
Netta, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the invitation, and I feel privileged to be the first guest on the show.
My pleasure. Now, on to the study. In December 2023, Mr. Aungle's study titled Physical Healing as a Function of Perceived Time was published. The link for the study will be in the description, and I encourage you to read it in its entirety. It is the first study to demonstrate that perceived time can affect physical healing independent of actual time, meaning the subjects of the study healed according to how much time they thought had passed rather than how much time had actually passed. The first question that I have is, what was the initial spark that led you to study psychological influences on physical health?
Well, so I think actually that my interest in psychological influences on health was motivated by the results of this study, and I can tell you how this study came about. So my advisor is Professor Alan Langer, who was one of the first. She and John Kabat-Zinn were among the first Western academics to study mindfulness. Dr. Langer has a more extreme view in terms of the role of psychological factors on physiological outcomes than I think most people have. And so we're always looking for the next kind of what would be something that people would totally not expect to be related to mental states. And then how could we possibly show that, in fact, it is related? There's a previous study that was done in our lab with diabetics, and it was also looking at the effect of perceived time, this time on their blood glucose levels. And the graduate student who led that study, I always loved that study because I thought it was just such a compelling example of the role of psychological factors on even the most sort of basic fundamental physiological processes. The student found that so people came into the lab, they played video games while they monitored their blood sugar levels, and they were told they had to switch out the video game every 15 minutes in order to make sure they monitored the time. And they found that the decrease in blood sugar level looked almost even actually proportional to perceived time, even though, like in my study, the actual amount of time was always the same. So in our lab, we thought about, what about physical healing? Is that a function? Would that also be affected by, in direction you would think, by perceived time? But as you might imagine, the ethics board that oversees all human subjects research is not that enthusiastic about the idea of recruiting subjects to intentionally wound them. So we kind of talked about it here and there, and it come up. And I was looking for a project for my second year project. And one day in lab, we had a hockey player who was part of our lab that semester. And the idea, the way that cupping therapy works, which I don't know, are you familiar with cupping therapy?
I've seen a little bit about it. That they suction off somebody's arm or with some kind of suction device.
Yeah, it's one of those sort of like alternative kind of medicine approaches. It's meant to sort of decrease muscle tension. So a lot of athletes will use it after intense games or competitions. I think Michael Phelps was actually the person when he got out of the pool in the Olympics. He had these welts all over his body, and a reporter asked him what they were, and he explained what it was from cupping. I think that's what kind of kicked off interest in it. But the fact that it's cupping therapy and that it was something that people choose to do for helpful reasons, but it did leave these bruises on the skin, I had this sort of aha moment where I thought, this would work perfectly. I can definitely see a feasible way of testing this question experimentally. And so I just sort of went with it from there.
That's cool. I didn't know that about Michael Phelps. I can imagine a lot of people were like, the best swimmer in the world is doing it. Let me try it out. Uh,
That's exactly right. Yeah, the
I
science is a little bit iffy on whether it works, although it does seem to increase blood flow to the region, and that's actually kind of if anyone looks up, like you Google image cupping marks, you'll see immediately there's these sort of depends on the color of your skin, but these sort of like bruise-like discolorations. And what happens is you get this increased blood flow to the region, which causes the capillaries to burst, and so the increased blood flow to the region does. I There is some argument that it does help with muscle tension relief, but I do think that Michael Phelps, exactly to your point, if he does it, it must be effective. Yeah.
Okay. I want to ask about the theory underlying the study. You hypothesized that wounds would heal faster as long as the subjects thought more time had passed, and wounds would heal slower as long as the subjects thought less time had passed, regardless of how much time actually passed. And the hypothesis was based on the theory of mind body unity. Can you explain the theory of mind body unity?
Yeah. So I'd say, I think right now for my dissertation, we're currently working on articulating like a properly falsifiable scientific theory, which I'm calling sort of embodied models of health. And the idea is talking about how attention, beliefs, and expectations interact to shape health. But I think there's a simpler way to understand what we mean by the theory of mind body unity, right? Because it's sort of a simple principle, which is that, we talk about minds and bodies in everyday language as if these are neatly separable things. We can clearly say that's a mental thing, and that's a physical part of the body. But in practice, our brains and our bodies operate as one integrated unit. Whatever's happening in our brain is happening in our bodies, and what's happening in our bodies is influencing what's happening in our brains, right? So there's this fundamental unity between mind and body that is why we believe that you see all these mind-body effects on health that are increasingly being studied by psychologists and medical researchers and others.
And do you have an intuitive sense of mind body unity, or is it more of a theoretical exploration into the unknown?
Um, so I think the answer could kind of be both. Maybe you could tell me a little bit more what you mean by the question.
For me, the reason I found it so amazing is because it felt counterintuitive that my perception of time could actually impact the physical healing of my own body. And I mean, it's counterintuitive in a way, but in another way, like knowing about placebo effects and stuff like that, it's not that counterintuitive. But I guess I don't really have an intuitive sense of it, but it makes sense.
So I'm curious what your intuition is around this. So there are increasingly rare numbers of peoples, but there are some indigenous peoples who have, relatively untouched by modernity, who don't, keep time with clock. They don't, have a clock time based kind of society in the way that we do. Do you think that if explained, I'm sure they could understand what hours in the day are. Surely they keep track of time in some way, if not by hours that they just don't track as tightly as we do. Do you think that having somebody, who's totally unfamiliar with the experience of telling time from a clock would experience the effect of, that we saw in our participants in the lab? So I have an intuition about this, and I'm curious.
I feel like they probably wouldn't have the same effect.
Yeah, that's my intuition also, exactly. And so I think that there are at least two, pathways that that these kinds of effects come about. One is, most of us, we've gotten at least we've a paper cut, some kind of bruise, injury, or maybe something more serious, like we've broken something, and we have experiences of hurting ourselves and associating the passage of time with the healing process, right? So we have these implicit learned associations between time passing. And how do we know in most, especially over short periods of time, how do we know that time is passing? Do you use a sundial? Do you look to the heavenly bodies and divine exactly how much time has passed? No, you look at a clock, right? So you're used to associating healing with the passage of time, and most of us, we tell how much time has passed by looking at a clock and saying, "Oh, yeah, okay, it was this time then, and now it's this time," or we have feedback from a timer. So that kind of implicit association is one way from past experience, and then the other way would be the kind of explicit belief, like I heal pretty quickly, or noticing that if it's been twice the amount of time, that they did a conditioning exercise before they came into the lab that mirrored what they did in the lab. So they had some experience with developing an expectation for the amount of healing that happens in 30 minutes. There's been about twice that. Then if they have a conscious expectation that they should be healing more, that would be a more explicit pathway. And we think both of those implicit kind of associations and explicit beliefs are what create these effects.
And are you guys studying maybe the limits of the mind's influence on the body? Like, where is there any hard limit for where does the mind stop and the body begin?
Well, I mean, I think that's with the unity. There is no that it's there's no clear boundary, right? Because there was a movement in like the cognitive science part of psychology called embodied cognition in like the 70s and 80s that was talking about the ways in which the fact that we are brains in bodies that have certain kinds of senses. We get, they can process certain kinds of sensory information. It shapes the ways that we think about concepts in the first place. But it's also true that the ways that we think shape the kinds of sensory experiences that we have in the body. That there is no clear, I mean, yes, clearly the brain is in my head behind my skull, but in terms of the way where its integration with my body, where that point is definitively, and then you can say on this side is my brain, and on this side is my, where my mind is, and then this side is my body. I don't think that clear line exists.
Okay, that makes sense. So moving on to the actual experience, I have a couple questions about the variables used in the study.
Yeah.
So while your study focuses on the relationship between perceived time and physical healing, previous studies have examined the relationship between perceived time and biological markers like the blood glucose levels and EEG activity. For me, the physical healing just hits different than like sugar levels. Uh, why did you choose physical healing as opposed to like one of the biological markers?
Well, so I think that's exactly it. Like I said earlier, we're always as a lab sort of looking for opportunities to demonstrate, and usually that's by finding something that's counterintuitive that you wouldn't normally think would be associated with a mental state, and looking to show that, because from the perspective of mind-body unity, all physical states must be connected somehow to mental states. We may not know how that relationship works, but that it must be there. That's the kind of premise that we're starting from.
Okay. And the the other variable I wanted to ask about was perceived time. As a fan of like time travel movies and the concept of time in general, I was drawn to the study. What motivated you to focus specifically on time perception, and does that differ from the other psychological factors that have been studied?
I think it does. I mean, I think this conversation can get pretty wonky, even among those of us who really enjoy it, which I find that was something that when I, first was diving into the study and getting started, I thought of the perceived time element as sort of a kind of interesting expectation, but still just kind of an expectation. I hadn't really thought about what is time. And the more I, thought about the design for the study, I realized, I mean, certainly there is time in the sense that change is happening continuously around us. But the way, and we know how, we have, months, days, hours, minutes, and all that, like what's happening. There's the rotation of the Earth on its own axis, and we're moving around the sun, but the idea that we're sort of imposing this concept of time uh, on the world in ways that have lots of, logical, yeah, it's for lots of practical and very useful reasons that we do it, but that it's kind of a concept that we create as much as it exists. It's both, it really does exist in the world, but also the way that it exists, we impose a kind of structure on it through the way we understand it. And I do think that makes it a kind of unique psychological predictor in these kinds of studies. Yeah.
It's very unique. Can you share a summary of the experimental design?
Yes. Well, so in the question that you sent me ahead of time, you mentioned one alternative would be you explain it to me in lay terms, and I could correct you where you're wrong. I'm happy to explain it if you'd like, if you feel more comfortable with me explaining it. But I thought it could be fun if we go through what you took from it and go from there.
Okay, when I envision it, there's a set of people, and they go through three different circumstances. One group is the slow time group, one group is the normal time group, and the other group is the fast time group. The normal time groups gets the actual time. The slow time groups gets half of the actual time, and I might be getting mixed up with the fast and the
You're
slow,
right.
but the fast time group gets double the time, and each person goes through each of these. And when you measure it, as you predicted, the longer they thought they were there, the faster the wounds healed, and the shorter time they thought they were there, the slower the wounds healed.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So you got it exactly right. And those are definitely the main details. So what we did was we recruited participants for a study. The cover story for the experiment was we were interested in the relationship between personality and healing after cupping therapy. So that's the premise that we recruited participants on. And when they came, the people who responded to our advertisements completed an enrollment survey and came into the lab to pick up cupping kits that they would take home with them and do an exercise at home that basically was the same procedure that they were going to experience in the lab with just a few modifications. So that way they had the experience of doing the exact same cupping procedure, looking at the mark on their forearm, then waiting 30 minutes and looking at it again and seeing how much it healed over that time. And they did that for 1 week before coming in for their lab sessions. Then the week after their last at-home exercise, they came into the lab 3 times. So some people came into the lab 3 days in a row. Some people spread it out kind of over the week, but they came in on 3 separate occasions. And we randomized, we randomized the condition order. So some people had the fast time condition first, some people had the slow time condition first, and so on. And they came into the lab. We had the cover story for taking their belongings, including any watches and phones and things like that, was so that they wouldn't be distracted, because they had to monitor a timer in order to complete these healing observation surveys, which would just ask them a few short questions about the marks on their arm. And so we didn't want them to be distracted, so they wouldn't miss one of their surveys. And so we took their belongings and put them away for the duration of the session. And then in actuality, they completed a survey every 4 minutes, but we told them that we were interested in seeing differences depending on how long we observed the healing process, because the cupping marks, we know that we often didn't see it fully heal no matter how long they were in the lab. So seeing slightly different observation periods. And so we told them they would do the survey, the interval would change from session to session. And so after they did the healing observation surveys, because we told them that they were going to come 3 times for 1 hour, but we manipulated their time perception, right? So on one of the sessions, participants came in and thought they had only been in front of the computer for 14 minutes, but they'd been in front of it for 30 minutes. So we had to have them do something after that, so that when they got their belongings back, they didn't immediately go, hey, You lied. There's no way this makes any sense. So they did something in that condition, in the 14-minute one, we had them do something that was really hard and really boring. And so that way, even just doing that for 10, 15 minutes, you believe you've been doing it for half an hour, is it just like, it just feels, it's that kind of task. And then in the fast time condition, we had them watch these really kind of fun videos, sort of analogous to kind of like, if you pick up TikTok, you might think you've only spent 10 minutes, but actually you spent an hour. When you're enjoying it, it's hard to say how long the videos were. And so that way that we could obscure it. One of my favorite and you asked also about what was surprising to me about the study. The results were gratifying, and they were surprising in some sense, but we did predict them. But what was surprising to me is I really was like, I read this research and I knew from a previous graduate student that people really aren't, usually don't have that good of an internal sense of time perception, so that the manipulation really, it would work. But I was like, I don't know how people are not going to notice this. But people really didn't notice. And so seeing the look of surprise at the end when we debriefed them and told them what the study was actually about was really fun. Because, people doing these studies usually are trying to figure out what the researchers are asking. So yeah, seeing, because they didn't guess it. So that was fun.
How do you think the results would have differed if they knew that perceived time was was one of the variables?
Yeah, that's interesting. So like I was saying earlier, I think that like the two main pathways that these effects, the through which we see these effects are the past experiences, the past associations that we've had. So for people that have had injuries and have healed quickly, I think even if they kind of knew what was happening, I think the false feedback from the timer might kind of have an effect. But then there's also the kind of belief, the conscious belief pathway. And I think, that it's helpful if the two are aligned, your past implicit associations and your conscious interpretation both are, in the direction that you want to go. In this case, that you're going to heal faster. If we told them, then I think people would think, yeah, but that's not accurate. So like the conscious belief would kind of it wouldn't be as strong of an effect. There's something called open label placebo research where they tell people that they're giving them placebos. And in fact, you do still see placebo effects, which is pretty amazing.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, they come in, they tell them, you go into like a doctor's office, you see someone in a white lab coat, they tell you that we're giving you something that isn't an active medication, but we have a lot of evidence that it does work. So there's a lot of context so it's not just that there's some random, Joe Schmo off the street gives you something to take and says this will help. It's a lot of things to that I think helps your brain feel convinced that it is likely to work. But they do tell them there's nothing active in this treatment. I don't know if they use the word placebo, but they say you're not getting any active medication in the treatment.
That is really interesting. I want to ask about like the implications of this on the medical field. How can the results of your study be integrated into existing healthcare practices?
Yeah, so I think the idea that psychological influences are omnipresent, that they are relevant for all patients in the healthcare system, is something that these results underscore, and hopefully for anyone working in healthcare, the kinds of expectations and beliefs that people come in with are influencing their treatment trajectories and ultimate outcomes. And so it is worth trying to understand a little bit more about what's happening at that level, because it is contributing to the outcomes that they experience.
Do you think the day ever comes when the doctor is like giving you your prescription and it says mindfulness practice?
100%. I think actually it's already here in some places. For example, there was a study idea that I was looking into where I was talking to a lot of oncologists at one point. And so speaking to a lot of leading oncologists at a lot of the teaching hospitals in the country. And it was far more common than not for the clinicians that I spoke to just as a matter of course refer anyone getting a new diagnosis to see a psychiatrist or psychologist as part of treatment, because they know that that aspect is just as important to the outcome as their patients. They think about it. They don't think they have yet to think about it fully from our mind-body unity perspective, but they do appreciate that things like stress, that a lot of psychological influences do matter to their patients. So I think we're getting closer and closer. Not there yet, but getting closer. I do think we'll get there.
That's interesting because they're kind of the people with terminal illnesses. They kind of have the most on the line, and the people who are directing them are saying these mindfulness practices are very important. So, that's
That's right.
interesting. I want to ask about I don't know how often you come across this type of thing on social media, but my feeds are like rife with affirmations, manifestations, the law of attraction. These kind of things seem to be gaining significant ground amongst millennials and Gen Z, even relative to traditional religious practices. How, if at all, do these concepts fit into the theory of mind body unity?
Yeah. So I think there's a version of manifestation that's fully compatible with what we know from psychological science. But I think that sometimes the more popular versions on social media can be a bit misleading. Like, for example, visualizing accomplishing your goals. There is research that suggests that that can increase the odds that you will, but not always. Like, how you visualize accomplishing your goals matters. For example, like imagining just like, so if I'm giving a talk and I imagine that the people giving like the applause at the end and smiling and feeling good, like that went well, that actually can be counterproductive because what happens is by imagining that aspect of accomplishing the goal, I'm sort of already giving like I'm imagination and actual experience overlap quite a bit in the brain. So I'm kind of giving myself that kind of rewarded experience as if I've already reached the goal, which is making me less motivated to do all the things that I need to do versus if I visualize that I do it, but I think about what might happen that could throw me off or how, but think through it with that kind of more constructive, like what sort of things might come up? What might I try? What might be especially effective? That kind of visualizing and in a productive way. So I'm not visualizing, oh my God, I can imagine all the things that goes wrong, but I am thinking that I won't be able to deal with it. But I am thinking I'm not just sort of like basking in the sun before I get there. Right. So I think that like that kind of imagining of manifestation probably unlikely to work there. And also, with mind body unity, I think like if you're focusing on the outcome, it's a similar kind of thing. If you're, focusing on the outcome in a way that ignores what's happening in the moment, like denying what's happening in the present is never productive. So I think that it depends what we mean by this language, and I don't think like that these are and the science suggests that manifesting increases the probability that you will obtain whatever it is that you're manifesting. Is not a guarantee either. So I think that that is also something like that. It's not a promise that if you do it even if you do it exactly perfectly, it's still going to be an increase in probability, not a guarantee that so it's not like if it didn't happen, it doesn't mean you're doing it wrong necessarily or anything like that. So I think that yeah.
That makes sense. So there's a right way to do manifestation, and there's a wrong way. That
Yeah.
makes sense.
And I think we kind of intuitively know where that line is, but sometimes reminding ourselves of the line is useful.
I've got one more question. Do non-human animals experience mind-body unity, or is this uniquely human?
So the kind of associations, for example, it's not traditionally thought of in this way, but Pavlov's dogs. I've heard of the sort of yeah.
Yeah, when the dog is like slapped or something every time it does something. I can't remember what is it.
So there are a number of versions because the idea that it gets at is what's called classical conditioning. But I think the original one was maybe pairing a bell with food, and because they would salivate when they would when they saw that they were getting their food, they would salivate. But then at a certain point, because the bell was paired with the food, they could just ring the bell and the dogs would salivate. Right. So you can kind of produce, if you give an animal a certain kind of physical experience associated with a certain cue, and then you just present the cue again, you can have they will have that physical experience most likely. So they can kind of have that kind of associative mind body effect. But when we think about like perceived time, animals don't have concepts like that, like we have. They don't. So the kinds of possibilities, that kind of the belief pathway that I was talking about, where we consciously, explicitly believe something that has to do with our concepts and the ways that we apply them to understand the world, and those also seem to be related to mind-body effects. And I don't think that, as far as we know, animals don't have anything like our conceptual systems to understand the world. So I think that they don't have that same pathway.
Okay. And what's after this study? Has this study raised any research questions or avenues for exploration?
Yeah, for sure. When you ask about the real life applications, something that we're looking at in a field context is looking at recovery after surgery in patients getting cataract surgery, hernia surgery, and dental surgery, with the idea that the perceived time effect that we observed in the cupping study was building on implicit healing time expectations that we have, meaning that if we directly manipulate patients' healing time expectations, we think that, so patients believe that they are going to heal faster, that we think that they actually will heal faster. And that's something that we're working on testing right now. More big picture, I'm really interested. So there's all this interesting mind-body effects. We talked about the blood glucose levels. There's research showing that people's perceived physical activity predicts mortality independent of their actual physical activity. It's kind of interesting. People can consume identical beverages that they think have different sugar content, and their blood sugar responds differently, even though the beverages are exactly the same. We have my healing study. I'm really interested in, and oftentimes these results are explained in terms of placebo effects and expectations. But I think that that's accurate, but kind of doesn't capture the richness of the underlying psychology. And so my longer term goal is to try to better understand, like, what are the psychological processes underlying these effects.
Well, I look forward to finding out the answers to those questions. It's like physical
Yeah.
healing on a way grander scale when it comes to recovery times for surgery. So that'll be interesting. I will be on the lookout for more of your fascinating research. I appreciate you for coming on episode 1 of All Trek. It has been a learning experience for me, and I know it will be for anyone else who watches. So thank you for joining me.
It has been for me as well. And thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
That was awesome. I love that the study showed how tapped into the mind the body is. It's tapped into our minds even beyond our conscious thoughts, beliefs, and expectations. If you needed a reason to be optimistic, here it is. Now, don't be in denial, but do be kind to yourself. And do join me on the next All Trek.